hanged up high where the crows can pick at them, by J. Wilburn. And let's jump right in. Sheriff Albert Pate deputized half the town to be sure these three finished their lives on the end of a rope. The gallows had been slapped together in a hurry. Judge Kemp stood beside the sheriff after the two of them had rushed the trial more than building the hanging place. All right, I'm not sure that sentence works. Judge Kemp stood beside the sheriff after the two of them had rushed the trial. Let's say worse. Rushed the trial worse than the building of the hanging place. All right, I think that's a little clearer. All right. Pate had convinced the judge that it was too dangerous to move the Delta boys to a bigger city for a proper hearing. Kemp didn't need much convincing. This was only three of them, but it was an important three, and several hundred other members of the gang were scattered across the country. Any delay, even one for something as noble as due process, might see these three busted out and most of the town burned and killed in the process. Okay, I've used the word process twice, so I need to do something about that. Killed, let's say, in the wake. The Delta boys had done far worse for far less. All right, that looks good. The gavel had no more than been settled back on the bench, and I don't like that sentence either. The gavel had no more than fallen. Let's simplify that. Everybody understand how the gavel works. All right, the gavel had no more than fallen before the fresh deputies dragged the defendants out of the courthouse and up the loose boards of the gallows steps. "This is your part, Al," Judge Kemp elbowed the sheriff. "Place the nooses," he said. Grumbles of agreement ran through the crowd as the wind picked up more dust from the dry street. The deputies on the platform fed the loops over the criminals' heads and tightened up the knots. If the bad men had their hands loose, Al knew these fellows on the platform wouldn't be half as bold. All right, let's keep going. "What about the hoods?" someone from the crowd asked. Al and Kemp exchanged a look. The judge spoke up. "No time. If this is not a scene you care to see, you are dismissed." No one left, but Al knew they had messed up. "Last words," the sheriff called up from the street. "Mr. Santiago Smith." The fellow on Al's... Okay. The fellow, let's say, on the left, as he faced... The fellow on the left as... the town. All right, the fellow on the left as the town faced the platform took a step forward. His boots thumped on the trap door. Al wondered if the bandit realized he was doing them a favor. Santiago spoke bold and clear. "You are the villains in this story. Each one of you has no love of justice, and your soft tyranny of the apathetic will be the end of you. Men like the sheriff and this so-called judge will pervert justice any time it serves them." Santiago was a strange bird. Al wasn't sure the man was Spanish at all, but who was he to say? His whole life had been spent in two towns. The Delta boys were well-traveled. Santiago had a sharp jawline. Could have been an actor with that voice and that face if he'd done something with his life other than murder and steal. He was looking pale in the bright sun today, as Al supposed that was understandable considering he was about to hang. Still, the guy was pasty white out here in the desert climates. Strange. Looked like a vampire in the sun. Sweat beaded Santiago's hairline as he continued his speech. "There will be retribution. There will be a reckoning. The Delta boys don't forget their enemies, and today every single one of you has made the worst enemy you could possibly—" "Drop him," the judge yelled. It wasn't his place, but the order was followed. The first crude lever pulled, and the first Delta boy dropped until the rope stopped him with a snap. All right, I'm going to put a comma right there because it's two complete clauses. All right. Stopped with a snap. He did not twitch at all. He took 3 wide swings and then settled into a slow twist from side to side. "Move Mr. River Spitz on up," Sheriff Al Pate said. River was a bigger man, but didn't put up a fight as his boots thumped on his trap door. "Last words," Al called. He feared his own reluctance sounded clear in his voice. River stuttered over a few syllables, but then spoke up barely above the dying wind, as it was the sort of humility that would have served him well in life. I'm real sorry, River finally formed a sentence. I'm sorry to my mama. I'm sorry to my father, brothers, sisters, and their kids. Wish they was still alive, but kind of glad they didn't live to see me like this. I have two theys, so I'm going to take one of those out. All right. Live to see this. I guess I'm just trying to say that, well, I don't know what would have done anything different given the chance to live my life over. If I was that kind, I probably would have made better choices the first time through. Maybe wouldn't have killed so many people just out of spite, but who knows? I don't. I don't know. After the wind punctuated the silence for a few beats, Al asked, "Is that it?" River shrugged, causing his noose to ride up his thick neck an inch or two. I guess I better be sorry to God, too, while I have a chance, but I guess that's it, sir. Al nodded and called, "Pull it." The trapdoor burst open. River's weight took care of his neck. Okay, the trapdoor burst open. Let me add here. The man scraped the sides of the opening on his way down. Al had a split second of fear that the man might get stuck. Okay. River. Let's say River. No, this needs to be the same paragraph. All right. River fell through and his weight took care of his neck. There were 3 distinct cracking noises. The second body twisted around 3 times as... Okay, this needs to be lowercased. Can you hear a helicopter flying over my house? All right. As all drew in breath to see about the last man. I missed some things here. Sounds like it's landed on my house. All right. As all drew in breath to see about the last man, and the worst one by any measure, River's rope snapped and he hit the ground with authority. The crowd grasped. All could tell by the position of the landing and the unnatural turn of his head that the man's neck was broken, and he had gone to face God. As sorry as he was able. Still, he took the time. Let's say Al. Still, Al took the time to send a deputy to confirm it before moving on. Delroy Joy stepped up onto the third trapdoor like it was his own idea to do so. Al almost couldn't find the words or the will to say them once found. Okay. That sounds fancy. All right. Only one left, and he was the head of the dragon. Al kind of wanted to take the time to track down the hoods, but that to cover this face, but that would leave his evil soul on Earth a bit too long for the sheriff's liking. Last words Al managed to say again. Delroy Joy made a show of leaning over the open trapdoor next to him where River Spitz had died and then snapped his rope as a final insult. Okay, let's say final insult in the same fashion old Judas had died. Then snapped his rope as a final insult in the same fashion old Judas had died, according to the word. All right, he looked back up and winked at the crowd. I guess that fat little man had one more surprise for all of us. Maybe I'll have one for you too. Delroy cut his eyes to the hazy west like he was expecting something or someone to come. The crowd checked that direction too, as check that direction too. Let's put a comma there. As uneasy murmurs traveled about. That it? Al called. Delroy made a big, loud sigh. The crowd went silent and turned their full attention up instead of west. Well, Al, Delroy began, I'm not sorry like River, so I won't be babbling about forgiveness or my mama today, and I don't think much about justice, so I won't be calling down retribution like Santiago was trying to do. So I guess sure, Al, that's about it. Good luck. Al hesitated. He almost let the question slip as to what Delroy Joy might be wishing him luck for. Al felt he needed it, but wasn't sure he wanted it coming from this dark soul. Pull it, the sheriff whispered. The door fell downward on its rough hinge. Delroy dropped and never blinked. He bounced on the end of his rope and swung as his legs kicked and his body jerked from side to side. Figured he wouldn't have the decency to just break his neck and die outright. The crowd murmured again as Delroy finally went still, with his eyes bulging and his face a raw shade of purple. Take him down and let's get them buried away. So that Delroy kicked again. He managed to blink and arched his back. Judge Kemp cursed, and he wasn't the only one. All right, there needs to be a comma there, because we have two complete clauses. All right, Al found himself wishing he'd just accepted Mr. Joy's offer of good luck. Oh, thank you for the raid. I appreciate it, Rebecca. All right. They waited for him again. They waited him out again. This time his face was almost black. Al sent a deputy to poke Delroy with a stick. As the deputy shoved deep into the bandit's ribs, Al found himself thinking about Jesus on the cross. That would have made the rest of them the Romans. For some reason, the deputy poked a second time and Delroy moved again. This time he didn't thrash. The dying bandit just smiled and his bloodshot eyes tracked the crowd. The deputy dropped the stick and bumped one of the posts as he staggered away. A wet, wispy sound escaped Delroy's throat through the puckered flesh around the noose. The man's lips moved as if he had something new to say. Hey, thanks for dropping in. I appreciate you saying something on chat, too. Thank you so much. All right. His lips moved as if he had something new to say, but no sound other than the smack of his swollen lips. His tongue hung out, and Delroy bit it twice as he continued his silent speech. Thank you for the follow, too. I appreciate it so much. You guys are really giving me a boost here as I'm working my way through this gory little story here. All right, we had his tongue coming out, the blood dripped dark onto the sand under his swinging boots. Ow, Judge Kemp whispered. The sheriff drew his gun and thumbed back the hammer. Delroy paused in whatever he was saying, but he didn't seem afraid with his clownish grin and his bleeding tongue sticking out. Al took careful aim. The crowd moved aside east and west. He pulled the trigger, and everyone startled even though they knew what was coming. A hole as black as midnight opened in the center of his shirt, just a hair to the left of one of the buttons. Delroy shook with the impact. Al couldn't tell if it exited his back. A small dribble of blood ran down the front, no more impressive than a drop of wine. Delroy blinked twice, and a wheezy exchange of breath followed. It took Al a few seconds to realize that Delroy Joy, now hanging for nearly 10 minutes and shot in the chest to boot, was laughing at him. He managed two wheezy words for the sheriff. Try again. Al raised his weapon and emptied it into the body. More wine spilled from more holes. Delroy drooped and the entire town exhaled all at once like air escaping a mine shaft. The relief was short-lived as Delroy raised his head to wheeze and laugh again. More guns and rifles raised all around. Most of them were not officially deputized. Neither Al nor Judge Kemp said a thing to call them off. Delroy was the one who gave them permission. Good luck, he wheezed. Bullet. The town unloaded on him. They tried twice more to hang him, but now riddled with bullets. Delroy Joy barely spoke and barely bled. His neck refused to snap. I just about got a rejection from the sub I sent 3 weeks ago. I'm sorry about that. I was... Recently, I started cataloging all the stories I've written, all the novels, all the novellas, short stories, everything, and was tracking the publishing and submission histories of all of them, and because my biggest fear was that I was going to accidentally send a story to the same editor over again because I'd submitted so many. And of course, even with acceptances, it was mostly rejections. Because I'll get a story rejected 4 or 5 times and get it accepted the sixth time, and I consider that a win. But having to write down reject over and over again in the list for all those stories was very humbling. So rejections will still hit pretty hard, but it's cool that you submitted a story anyway. All right. As they brought him to his feet, he slumped in the gaps. Okay, hold on. On the ground, the crowd took turns bludgeoning him with every hammer and club-like object they could find. His bones refused to snap and his body darkened all over with bruises. He still refused to die. That's why I use Duotrope. I can't track it properly on my own. I haven't gone into Duotrope in a while. I used it back in the dark ages when it was free. And I paid for it for a little while and then just backed off of it. I'm actually only just now getting back to submitting stories again. I'd kind of taken a break from it for a while. I was self-publishing a lot, and then I would just yeah, I self-published too. I would just go to ones that I was invited to. But I kind of feel like I needed to get myself out there. So one of my New Year's resolutions was to submit a few more stories. So I think I've submitted 4, and I have 1 that's still out and 3 that got rejected. But I think high rejection rate is just a byproduct of submitting, and a lot of times I don't think it really has much to do with the story itself. It just has to do sometimes with how it fits what they're doing. Because I've had stories rejected by smaller paying markets and then accepted by a bigger one without much improvement. So I really think sometimes it's just up to what the editor is looking for, and may not have anything to do with the quality of the story itself. Other times I have been able to improve the quality over time. So I think it's a good practice to submit. I do think my writing's improving as I go, but I think that there's something to like that process of submitting and having it rejected and then saying, okay, maybe there's something I can look at here again. So I'm kind of putting myself back into the grinder for that too. All right. As they brought him to his feet again, he slumped in the grasps of reluctant deputies. The darkest bruises were ringed around his neck from 3 hangings. As he smiled, a few yellow teeth showed through the bullet holes in his cheeks. All right. I'm kind of careful about the type of stories I write. I will write some extreme horror and some splatterpunk stuff, and I've published some of that professionally. But on stream, I try not to do my most gory stories. So I think this one kind of goes up as far to the line as I'm willing to go, and I may actually do some more with it off stream as well. But a lot of times I try to go with more of the fantasy stuff and like the lighter fare that doesn't quite have as much blood. But I guess I'm going to my limits a little bit here for stream. All right, Delroy Joy's voice sounded like gravel, maybe from the ropes, so that was something. You guys are wasting a lot of time you don't have. One of the deputies whispered in Al's ear. He nodded, and they dragged Delroy into one of the shops. A few people watched through the windows a while, but then walked away green. Al and the judge watched from across the road. Delroy screamed. Blood splattered inside the glass and then splashed up again. The screaming went on. How? Judge Kemp asked. Al just shook his head. As the screaming and the sounds of meaty impacts continued, 2 men walked out with bloody leather aprons. They were coated in the stuff. Basically, you'd see if see it in a video game, it's permissible on Twitch. I know. I try not to go completely loose, though. I don't expect that I would get banned or anything like that, but I just sometimes there's stuff like that I kind of just save for off stream. But I gave it a little push here with sort of a bloody splatter western type thing. How, he asked. Okay. As the screaming and the sounds of the meaty impacts continued, 2 men walked out with bloody leather aprons. They were coated in the stuff. They whispered some instructions. All right. They whispered some instructions, and a few men in town went to see about whatever had been decided. The sheriff and judge were not consulted. One of the bloody men lit up a cigarette. He took a few puffs and then handed off to the other man. The first fellow blew out smoke from his lungs and nodded at Sheriff Pate. Al nodded back. The two men exchanged a haggard look and returned to the work inside. A few moments later, a half-dozen men showed up with axes. After they steeled their nerves a moment, they entered the shop. The sound of the blades hitting hard filled the street. That doesn't need to be a comma. Sometimes I'm throwing in random commas for no reason. A lot of people watched still, but from a great distance. Delroy Joy's scream in agony continued. I'm going to continued for a while. Okay, when things got quiet, Al thought it was his duty to check out the scene. He made it as far as the doorway. He made it as far as the doorway and saw them pushing Delroy's head into the wooden hand crank and cranked meat grinder. He turned, okay, let's say Al. Al turned away and fought to hold down his last meal. Alright, now we're going to add one more scene in here before we move on to what's already been written. Okay. Alright. They stacked Delroy on the wagon and ran for their lives. Al thought they were far enough away, but when the dynamite exploded, the cloud overtook 3 of the guys. When the dust cleared, those men lay dead. Al forced himself to move toward the crater. He stopped when he saw movement. The remains of a man with too much bone showing through flesh climbed out of the hole. Let's describe his eyes. The inhuman eyes fell on the sheriff, and then Delroy ran. The deputies weren't thrilled, but they followed Al's order to run the skeletal bandit down. All right. Now we'll move into the rest of it, and that should take us to the end. This may be it. They lifted his head from the trough of water for a third time. Delroy had been under for almost an hour this time. He was paler than Santiago had been before he died. Delroy was pale everywhere except from the gashes and rips. Let's say gashes, rips, and burns. And burns in his flesh. All right. Let me just take this whole thing out and add a different sentence in. All right. Delroy was pale everywhere except for the gashes, rips, and burns in his flesh. All right. The bone that showed through, say, the unbreakable bone. The unbreakable bone that showed through was almost as yellow as his teeth. All right. That looks good. Let's keep moving. After a few more seconds, he coughed and spewed up discolored water all over his ruined clothes and the muddy ground around the trough. My arms are tired, one of the deputies complained. Can someone sub in for me? Another man shuffled forward, but Al, let's capitalize our friend's name here, but Al held up a halting palm. Just put him on the ground for a moment. They propped Delroy against the trough with his hands tied and his boots out in two directions. The bandit heaved for breath as Al stood over him. Judge Kemp hissed through his teeth and wandered away a few feet. What are you? Al asked. Delroy choked on his laugh and then laughed some more. We have water drained out of holes in his chest. All right. Just tell me who you are. How is this possible? Some guys have all the luck, Delroy croaked. Are you a vampire or some kind of monster? Al asked. Have you been cursed? Are you even human? Delroy turned his bloody eyes west, where the sun was dying along the horizon. If I am, it's getting dark and your luck is running out with the light, Al. Why won't you die? Al asked. It's your job to kill me, Delroy said as he met the sheriff's eyes. It's not my job to die for you. How long have you been like this? Judge Kemp asked without turning around. Like what? Delroy asked, as if he were really curious. Immortal, Al answered for the judge. Hard to know such a thing. Delroy's eyes rolled, showing more bright red where the whites of his eyes should have been. We're all kind of immortal up until we find ourselves dead. Just most people like their... Okay, let's say, I'm missing a word here. Alright, just most people live like they're already dead and just waiting to make it official. Are you going to heal from all this if we let you? Al asked. You can't let that happen, the judge growled, but refused to face the accused. I guess we'll find out, won't we? You guys got to go to bed sometime. You've got to go back to life eventually, and trouble will come for you long before you figure any of this out. All right. It's getting dark, Sheriff, one of the deputies said. We're going to need tools and fresh men, Al said. Bring them kicking and screaming if you have to, but bring them. They shoveled more dirt and piled more rocks as the sun rose in the east. Everyone's hands were blistered and bloodied, even through their gloves. The grave had become a hill where there had once been a deep pit. Is this going to be enough? Judge Kemp asked as he dropped the pickaxe and sat down hard. Al had a hand resting upon one of the bigger rocks. He thought he felt a vibration, and he hoped that was from one of the shovels full of dirt and not something else below. Oh, thank you for dropping in. I appreciate it so much. I don't know, Al said. We probably should... Okay, I left something out here too. We probably should set guards on the place for a while. Okay. Judge Kemp looked away to be sure the other men were out of earshot. And what do we do if Delroy Joy does dig himself out? Al glanced at the mound of dirt and rocks as if saying the man's name might summon him. The sheriff shook his head. We hope our luck changes. All right. I was thinking of changing that ending. I'm not positive that's the strongest way to end it, but I also know that if I add too much in, trying to fancy it up or whatever, that it can get all convoluted. So for the time being, I'm just going to leave that statement as the end of it.